and welcome to Spectrum Live. We are the new live and interactive show from the National Autistic Society. So this show is about talking about the things that are important to autistic people and their families. And we did a survey called Your Autism Survey, and one of the key things within that survey that people said were important was diagnosis.
So diagnosis, which we're going to be talking about today, is the first topic that we're covering that you highlighted as something that you wanted to learn more about. Others will include socialising, mental health, education, starting a new job, going out and about, that sort of thing. But this one is our pilot. We hope to make more shows on some of these topics if this show is a success. So we are your lovely hosts for the evening. Hello, my name is Erin Eakins. I am an author. I am a former employee of the National Autistic Society, and I am autistic.
And my name's Robin Stewart. I'm also autistic, and you might know me as the co-host of BBC's podcast 1800 Seconds on Autism. So, as I said, this show is for autistic people and their families, and we are going to be meeting professionals, other autistic people, and giving you practical tips and advice, and today's theme is diagnosis.
We'll also be telling you how the National Autistic Society is campaigning with you in order to improve access to diagnosis.
And over the last 2 weeks, you've been submitting questions for our experts. It's not too late to submit your question. If you do so in the comments, we will try and answer as many as we can.
So this show is brought to you by the National Autistic Society, which is the UK's leading charity for autistic people. Since 1962, they've been here to transform lives, change attitudes and create a society that works for autistic adults and children. Now, we're running Spectrum Live as a pilot this evening, and we'd love to make it a regular series about the different topics that you've told us are important to you.
But we can only do this with your support. We hope that you enjoy this show, and we hope you find it useful. And if you do, please donate. You can do so at our website, www.autism.org.uk/live. Here's what's coming up on the show.
So we'll be talking to Dr. Sarah Lister-Brooke, who's the Clinical Director at the Lorna Wing Centre, which offers diagnostic and post-diagnostic services.
And we'll be meeting Samita, who is the voice of Ren and also a writer on Pablo, which is a programme on CBeebies. And we'll be meeting Bowie, his mum Faye, Grandma Diane, and hearing their story.
Niall, who you may know from Love Island, is going to open up about accepting his diagnosis.
And we're going to meet Tim Nichols, who's Head of Policy at the National Autistic Society, and they're going to be talking about their campaigns and how you can get involved.
To close the show, Dr. Sarah, Tim and George will be here answering your questions. If you'd like to ask them a question about diagnosis, comment on this video, give us a tweet at Autism with the hashtag SpectrumLive. And if you're not watching live, we may still use your questions on a future show, so please do keep tweeting us. We are watching.
OK, so let's watch a video from the Too Much Information campaign. This video features autistic actress Saskia, and it's about being out and about and experiencing unexpected changes, which can be really difficult for autistic people.
Now, some autistic people may find the noises and lights in this video a little bit overwhelming or difficult to watch. So if you think this may apply to you, maybe turn the sound down or look away. The video is only just about 1 minute long.
This is Diverted.
We're sorry to announce the train has been delayed. Please listen for further announcements. This train is diverted.
Sorry.
I'm autistic, and the fear of unexpected changes can make leaving the house impossible.
That was diverted from our Too Much Information campaign. Now that video has been viewed over 2 million times, and the campaign as a whole has had a huge impact on the understanding of autism amongst the general public. However, we know there's still an awful lot that needs to be done.
And to learn more about diagnosis, we have two amazing guests. We've got Dr. Sarah Lister-Brooke, who is the Clinical Director of the Lorna Wing Centre, which provides diagnosis and post-diagnostic services. And we've got Florence Leslie, who's autistic herself, and she's the National Autistic Society's in-house storyteller.
Hello.
Hello. How are you?
Good, thanks.
So, Sarah, we will start with you. Can you explain in plain English for us exactly what autism is?
Yes, okay, so I guess we think of autism as a lifelong condition, and by that some people might mean it's developmental. It's there from the beginning, it's just the way you're made, and it affects the way you interact with people, understand social communication, as well as possibly also making it difficult for you to adjust and be adaptive to new things.
And do you think autism is a disability?
That's a really interesting question. I think autism is a condition, and it might be a disability for some people, but not for everybody.
Florence, can you tell us a bit about how you found out that you're autistic?
Yes, so I was 21, I was in my last year of university, and I had always thought that I maybe might be autistic my whole life, but I was actually assessed as a teenager, and I was told that I was just quirky, which a lot of women on the spectrum, and that is their experience, and it's quite common to kind of get diagnosed later in life, much like myself. And so I ended up having quite a lot of mental health problems, and I nearly dropped out of my degree. And one day I decided just to try and get back on my feet and try and go along the way that I felt everybody else was living their life, and I tried to learn how to drive. And I was kind of like, I'm 21, you know, why don't I understand my left and rights? Why aren't I picking up learning how to drive? And so I went to my university support service, and after kind of everything that I'd been through trying to get diagnosed, trying to mask my difficulties because I thought, well, I can't possibly, you know, be autistic, I just ticked a random box saying I have trouble understanding people's facial expressions. And, you know, luckily the person employed said, well, yeah, you know, you might be autistic, and handed me the form. And here I am 3 years later on the sofa.
And Sarah, is it quite common for autistic women to be diagnosed later, and why is that?
Yes, I think it is largely because, as Florence described, it can take a while for people to recognise the difficulties that women and girls are having, because they're often very good at masking their difficulties and developing strategies to manage and cope in the world. However, the other problem we have is a lot of the descriptors for autism are very much based on a male profile of autism, so I think that makes it difficult too.
So, Florence, how do you think your life would maybe have been different or been changed if you'd gotten that diagnosis a little bit earlier?
So I feel like if I'd have been diagnosed younger, I think when I was growing up I had quite a lot of problems with being bullied. I was quite picked on by my peers, especially at secondary school and college. It's quite difficult for me, and I feel like perhaps if I had been diagnosed there might have been more provisions in place for me in order to be supported. I also had quite a lot of trouble passing exams, things at the first time, keeping up, and so I had a lot of pressure on me because obviously I was told that I wasn't autistic, so I didn't have learning support, and I think the pressure of that really kind of got to me as I got older, and I ended up, you know, having a lot of mental health problems. And so I feel like something I would probably say to my younger self, and really anyone that's watching out there, is, you know, you're not alone. One of the great things about being diagnosed is that there's kind of a community that I got to understand myself from, and you know, don't be afraid to seek help, because people are there to help you, and it will help you understand more about yourself in the process.
I think a lot of people will either relate to that, or that'll be really helpful for them to hear today or any other day. So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Florence and Sarah. Sarah's going to stay with us.
So thank you ever so much to Florence for sharing her story. Now, earlier this month, we met up with Bowie, his mum Faye and his grandma Diane to talk to us about how they came to realise that Bowie might be autistic. Some of you may find his story quite familiar.
Bowie, from the moment he was born, was quite tough in the sense of he never ever slept. He was crying quite often, and as a new mum, I struggled with this. I just assumed that I just didn't know what it was to be a mum properly yet. But as time went on and he wasn't hitting the milestones of walking and especially, obviously we had no
feeding
speech whatsoever.
His feeding weren't great.
It started to become clearer. Well, it became clearer for my mum, not for me.
I found I didn't realise it at the time, but when I look back now, I was making excuses for him in my head. I was thinking, oh, he's a boy, he's lazy. He'll do it when he's ready. And then trying to sort of say, well, yeah, but did all mine do it at that time? And I was trying to, and at the time I was working in a secondary school and I got asked to work with a 14-year-old autistic boy. So I had what would have been called like an initial meeting where I would have gone into a meeting with his mum just to get a little bit of background so I knew exactly what I was dealing with, like things he liked, didn't like, stuff like that. And it was almost like a light bulb moment. As she was talking, it was like someone was describing Bowie. Anyway, I got through the meeting, kept myself composed and sort of got out of the meeting, then went and had an in-depth chat with a Senko at the time. He just looked at me and said, you need to take him to the doctors, like, get the ball rolling. So we came round to you in the evening.
And then she said, I'm going to tell you something about Bowie. And I said, well, how am I not going to not know something about Bowie that you do know?
But at this point, I'd gone on the National Autistic website and printed off a lot of information because I thought, doesn't matter what I say, she needs to read it. So
and I read that the first initial page, which was kind of like a checklist of signs, and yeah, it was like reading.
She was going to be upset, but you was relieved.
No, I was relieved because I knew I wasn't a bad mum. Actually, there's more going on inside my boy's head than I know of, and that's when it started getting real for me.
There was no eye contact.
There was completely no eye contact, no speech, completely non-verbal. He was spinning constantly,
lining everything up.
Wouldn't actually play with toys, wouldn't imaginary play. Yeah, lots of, that's why I always say that when I read the National Autistic Society pages that my mum printed off, I would call Bowie textbook autism. As we know, every child with autism, every adult with autism is different. Not one is the same. But everything that was listed on the NAS website, my son ticked that box.
What a lovely family. Bowie is very, very cute and I want to take him home and give him a hug. But anyway, we will rejoin them later in the show just to find out how their story progressed from there.
But right now we are joined with, and I'm really excited about this, we're joined with one of the writers from CBeebies Pablo. She's autistic herself, her name's Samita, and she also voices Ren. Hi Samita.
Hi.
And we should just mention we've still got Sarah with us.
We've still got Sarah with us.
Of course we have, yeah.
So we're now going to talk about what you should do if you or someone you think you or someone that you know might be autistic. So Sarah, from your perspective, what should someone do if they think that they or their child or their family member or their friend may actually be autistic?
Well, the first point of contact is usually GP, because that's the person who's going to know how your local services are organised and what's going to be the best pathway or route to getting an assessment. So for children and young people, that might be a referral through to the community paediatric service. It could be for older children through to the child mental health service, and for adults, well, there are a range of options there, but some of those will be specialist autism assessments and sometimes they'll be through adult mental health services. So various routes, but start with your GP and start the conversation really with professionals about your concerns.
And what actually happens after you've had that conversation and hopefully that referral by your GP? What does it look like after that?
Well, then usually you'll have an initial assessment with somebody in the team at that service point who will look at the, if you like, probability or the chances that you do have autism, because obviously we want to make sure that only people go forward for those assessments where it's highly likely they have autism, because it's a special resource, if you like. And then that initial assessment, if it's looking likely that autism is part of your difficulties, then you'll be referred on to the specialist team.
And your abilities.
Good point. Absolutely. Yes.
So Samita, could I ask you what happened when you went to your GP?
Well, I had gone in because I wanted to go back to university and I'd been having some mental health struggles, so I wanted to make sure I was as supported as I could be, and I knew that you had to get an official diagnosis to be able to get the support. So I went into my GP, and it can be quite hard to go in and ask
Absolutely.
for a referral. So I basically written down what I wanted to say, and yeah, and he just asked me why I thought it would be important to get the diagnosis, and I said because I'd like to be supported, and yeah, he sent the referral on.
What happened? So you were 25 when you were diagnosed?
Yeah.
Is that correct? Fantastic. Could you, so from that referral from your GP, what was kind of the next steps in your journey towards getting that?
So after the GP appointment, I got posted some questionnaires, which I filled in and then sent to, I was lucky to have a local autism unit where I lived, so yeah, that went through to them, and then they gave me a date for an assessment.
I think we all know, anyone who's filled one of those in knows how fun.
Yeah, I had to do it twice, actually,
Twice?
because my forms got lost in the post.
Oh my goodness. Just making it easy for us, making it easy. So once you had that and you'd sent it off for the second time and it hadn't got lost in the post again, and once that had been done, what happened next?
So by this point it was, so I handed the forms in September, so GP appointment in June, forms went back in September, my assessment was in June, and that was sort of just getting asked lots of questions and some well not games, but sort of test things.
Puzzles.
Yes, some more fun than others. And I actually got told on the day that I was autistic, but that I had to wait for another process before it got confirmed. And
okay.
Yeah.
And how long did it take to get the official diagnosis letter?
It took until, I think it was, my final appointment was in September, but I think after June, it was probably a few weeks I got a draft of the results of my assessment. So
it's about an 18-month process altogether. Still a long time.
It's a long time. Is this sort of typical length of that we see with kind of diagnosis, the assessment process? Does it normally take that long? What are we looking
From
at
the
there?
sort of, I mean, that is a long time, and it can be longer in some cases, of course. I think that it is a bit of a process, as you found, is that, you know, someone has to start off with that initial assessment and then moving forward to see the specialist team. But it's really not good for people to have to wait a long time between those 2 points, because the anxiety builds up, understandably, and you want to get on with it, don't you?
And I think as autistic people, we're already existing at quite a high level of anxiety anyway, without that added on.
To add.
In terms of the assessment, is it different if you're an adult or if you're a child? I mean, I was diagnosed as an adult and Samita was diagnosed as an adult, so we've been through the adult diagnosis process.
Yeah.
But are there differences in how the two are diagnosed?
Well, fundamentally, there should be two important parts of the assessment, so for children and adults. So ideally, there should be a very thorough developmental and clinical history taken, so that we're looking at an individual's pattern of development over time, not just at a point in time. But in combination with that, there needs to be some observations, maybe some interactive activities, maybe looking at thinking and reasoning skills, a whole range of things. But every assessment should be individually tailored, because, you know, everyone's an individual after all. But those two key things, really, the developmental history and the observations.
And that's whether you're an adult or
a child.
Fantastic.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you, Samita, for sharing your story and gifting us with your marvellous rainbow headband. I love it so much. And thank you, Sarah. You'll be rejoining us later, so we won't say goodbye just yet. And you'll be with us to answer the questions that the audience are sending in to us. And you can still get involved by posting a comment below or using the hashtag SpectrumLive to @Autism on Twitter and submit any questions you have for lovely Sarah.
Great. So let's go back and find out what happened to Bowie.
So the assessment process for Bowie started with a paediatrician appointment, in which they done just an overall general assessment of him, where he was at. They asked him to hold some crowns and could he draw something, in which Bowie actually put it in his mouth. Or they sent us for a hearing test. The whole time Bowie was in the paediatrician appointment, he tried to escape the room. He didn't want to be in the room. He kept turning the lights on and off. Yeah, I think when I look back now, it was the paediatrician must have just thought, oh, this is an easy one in that sense, because everything he was asking him to do, Bowie wouldn't cooperate. From there, we had many paediatrician appointments. We had speech and language therapist appointments. We had occupational therapy appointments. Not that there was many, but we had a few. And I was very lucky in the sense of Bowie's whole diagnosis journey took 11 months, whereas some families wait absolute years.
Yeah.
But Bowie was diagnosed just after his 3rd birthday. Obviously, professionals are not allowed to use what they call the A word unless your child is diagnosed properly. So no one was actually using the autism word. Social and communication difficulties was the word I heard thousands of times, and that did make you feel like at times you were going crazy. But it's quite funny because when it comes to the diagnosis, they're just like, oh yeah, no, your child's got autism. But what I can remember about that day is we went in, I know I've spoken about, we got the diagnosis, what they said, and then we went back to my mum's house and I laid on the floor with him. We picked him up from nursery because he hadn't done half a day, and I laid on the floor with him and he was really tired this day, really, really tired, and I was shattered as well because it did feel like a chapter had closed and a new one had opened. Okay, we've received diagnosis, now let's start the next battle. What's the next fight ahead? Let's go for that one. And I just laid looking at him on the floor, and I just remember looking at him and I was just thinking, it don't matter, whatever the next fight is, for however long it will take, until even if I'm 80 years old and I'm still fighting this battle, he's got me, he's got our family, and that really is all that matters. And I just made it very clear to myself that I would go above and beyond to create as much awareness as I could.
So that was Bowie and Faye's story. Again, lovely family, and Bowie is so cute. I can't even handle it. So thank you so much to that lovely family for sharing their story with us. And we know that their story is probably a very common one that a lot of you may actually relate to. So we hope you're enjoying the first episode of Spectrum Live. As we said, this is only a pilot. We want to be doing more shows throughout the year, covering lots of different topics that you've said that you're interested in, involving lots of different guests and sharing a wide diversity of autistic voices, particularly talking about topics that you've indicated are important to you.
And you know, as we've been saying, we can't make these shows without you. So if you would like to donate to make more Spectrum Lives, please just go to www.autism.org.uk/live and click the donate button.
Fantastic. So, on with the show. Next up, we spoke to Love Island's one and only rainbow fish and autistic man Niall Aslam, and he told us how he came to accept his autism diagnosis.
And remember, if you do have a question for our panel, you can still submit them, so you can tweet at us, and the hashtag is Spectrum Live.
Now, here's Niall.
I'm Niall and you're watching Spectrum Live. I got my autism diagnosis fairly early on in life. I was 8 years old. So I got my diagnosis because my parents noticed that I was struggling a lot growing up. I used to cry a lot. I used to struggle when my routine was interrupted. I was really obsessive. I didn't tell any of my close friends that I had autism. I felt ashamed of it, so I just didn't tell anyone because I didn't want to be judged. I didn't tell my friends after school. The first time people that were close to me found out I had autism was after Love Island. My friends, when I came out of my autism diagnosis, were really supportive of it and just kind of accepted me. Now that people are aware of my autism, I'm glad that I finally came forth and said it, because I feel like Love Island isn't exactly a show that people would associate with it, and now people could kind of see that autism is a spectrum and that not everyone fits into the same category. Like, you can still do things that like people want to do. Like I still get on Love Island, but I'm just glad that I've raised some awareness. If you're a young person out there that thinks you have autism, then go to your GP, because they have a duty, if that's what you genuinely think, to get you out there for a diagnosis.
Talking about what it means to be young and autistic. Thank you so much for that, Niall.
And now we welcome onto the sofa Tim Nichols, who's Head of Policy and Campaigns. and George Stanbury, who is a campaigns officer and is also an autistic man. So can you tell us a bit about what the National Autistic Society does around diagnosis in terms of campaigns?
Yeah, sure. So about 3.5 years ago, some new statistics came out, and they said that the diagnosis waiting times across the UK were just too long. So adults were waiting on average about 2 years, but children were waiting on average 3.5 years after first going and asking for help before they actually then got their diagnosis. And that's a real issue, because if you think about it, getting a diagnosis is a really kind of critical milestone in the journey towards getting support. And it's really important that people are able to get that support in place nice and quickly, and they were struggling without a diagnosis. And so on the back of that, we launched our Autism Diagnosis Crisis campaign. We wrote to the Secretary of State for Health right then. We wrote to the Chief Exec of NHS England, and we said, look, this is a crisis and it needs something to be done about it. I would say it's been a long campaign, but we've got some good commitments out of both government and NHS England. So now, actually, diagnosis waiting times are being measured for the first time. I mean, it's kind of scandalous that that wasn't happening before, but that was the reality. So nothing could really be done about it, because we didn't know how long each and every person was having to wait for a diagnosis. But there's still a lot that we need to do. So we're measuring those times. We need to make sure that local areas are held to account on those times. There's guidelines from the health watchdog NICE that say that no one should have to wait longer than 3 months between being referred for a diagnosis and being seen for the first time. Now, we know that's being missed up and down the country. We hear that all the time. But that's what we think people should be held to account to. And that's why we think the government needs to create, a measure that they're holding each and every CCG, so that wherever you are in the country, you will walk in and you will be able to know that you're going to get a diagnosis in good time.
And CCG is a clinical commissioning group,
yeah.
And they're all over the country. George, can you tell us a bit about what you do?
Yeah, so I work as part of our campaigns team. So what I do is I support national campaigns on areas such as diagnosis, things such as mental health, and also public understanding. I also work with our local volunteer branches. We have 115 branches up and down the UK, and I work with them on various issues that are really important to their communities. One example I've been working on really recently is with our Calderdale branch up in Yorkshire, with Calderdale and Kirklees CCGs, to help reduce diagnosis waiting times. In August, we found out that the average waiting time was about 5 years, which I know, it's not great, is it? And as Tim was saying, for the average should be far lower. So I've been working with volunteers. All of our branches are run by volunteers. And so I've been working with them to help use their influence with decision makers, with the council, with their CCG, to really help improve things for families up and down that community. One aspect in which that has been improved is they've streamlined their diagnostic pathway, and they've also provided funding for support during the wait for a diagnosis.
That's fantastic. So, as an autistic man yourself,
yeah.
How has it been for you growing up with, you received an early diagnosis, is that correct?
Yeah, so I received a diagnosis when I was 5, and it was spotted really early on when I was at nursery. So we got a diagnosis really quite quickly, actually, which was quite surprising. And it was really important, I think, for my parents, so they could kind of understand me, and some of the ways that they could support me. And they have been incredible, using techniques that they've been taught and just going on the hoof a little bit, like sometimes you need to. And for me, it's been really much easier to get the support that I need, be that through school, be that through other services that I've needed. But I also think most importantly for me, as someone who doesn't necessarily need much support on a day-to-day basis, it's socially and actually for understanding my own behaviour. I think there are really clear triggers when I can get quite stressed, and what that can mean for me, I get incredibly forgetful. And actually for my friends, they can be really understanding, and they can say, George, you're looking a little bit stressed, do you want to just have a moment? And actually I had one friend say to me just in the pub last week that they didn't know I was autistic until I told them, but now they do. They actually understand so much more about how I function and how they can really help me, be really good friends with me and figure out what I need.
It's that moment of kind of that, when you get your diagnosis and you understand yourself, is a little bit, it's that moment of, oh, this is why.
Absolutely.
And then obviously that stretches over to other people as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for telling your story. So, is there anything our audience can do to support all this lovely campaigning work at the moment?
Yes.
Yeah, there definitely is. There we go. No.
So at the moment, this year is 10 years since the Autism Act, which still is the country's only act that is specifically designed for improving the lives of people with a single condition. It's going to be 10. It's being reviewed as to how successful it's being, but in order to make sure that review does all the things that it can, we're asking people what their experiences are up and down the country. And although the Autism Act is England only, we want to hear from everyone in whatever country of the UK. So if you can visit our website, fill out our survey, we can make sure that we're asking the government to do all the things that we really think it needs to be doing to make sure that it's addressing not only the diagnosis crisis, but also improving services and creating a society that works for autistic people.
You can go to the website www.autism.org.uk.
So, next up, we spoke to some more staff members at the National Autistic Society, some autistic staff members, many of them my old colleagues, and they're going to be reflecting on their own diagnosis experience.
I think that having a diagnosis has really helped me all in all. I think that it's a really useful thing to help me kind of understand myself and understand behaviours and when I get stressed and what causes those.
It's given me the sort of early training, for lack of a better word, on how to fit into the non-autistic world.
It completely changed my life. I'm a much happier person now. My relationships are healthier and I'm much more confident than I was before. Completely changed me as a person in a good way.
It's also given me access to the sort of services that I needed. For instance, disabled student allowance.
I think at the time when it was explained to me, I genuinely thought I was going to die. But then it was sort of explained to me, my parents sat me down, they were kind of like, this is what this is, like it's completely fine, you'll be okay. And yeah, that was really reassuring.
It was such a relief and it was such a powerful explanation for me.
I think it's given me an understanding of why I think the way I do and why some things affect me more than they do other people.
I suppose part of me wished I could have just been left a little bit longer, just to establish my own identity before being labelled.
There has been an element of hindering in that people, once they know you're autistic, they tend to judge you on that first. So they think, oh, you think that way because you're autistic, rather than thinking, actually, you've got some professional experience of this, or you know what you're talking about.
I feel like it's restricted some of my choices in life, particularly what I wanted to do as a career.
I was very lucky because my parents have been like amazingly supportive, and my mum was very much that parent that was like on it and like going to all the like support groups for parents and staff, and she's actually now a learning support teacher.
I have a 3-year-old son who also got diagnosed. He's non-verbal, although now he's starting to say a few words, and he can now spell car and say car. I think being diagnosed, it's a weird thing because I'm seeing a lot of the things that I did when I was a little kid in him. And so I think being diagnosed for both of us has been really useful because early intervention is one of the things that has a really profound impact on autistic people, and that's something I didn't get. And that's something that may help him down the road.
Thank you so much to all the staff who took part in that video. The National Autistic Society is a charity, and we rely, well, not we, because I don't actually work for the NAS, but the National Autistic Society relies on donations to make Spectrum Live happy, to make Spectrum Live happen.
Which makes us happy.
Well, but hopefully it makes you happy. That's the important thing, you the viewers. So if you're enjoying this, then it would be great if you could donate. If you go to autism.org.uk, you'll see the donate button. So now we've got some questions and we're going to get some answers from our panel list of experts.
So we're still joined by Tim and George, and we welcome back Sarah. Hello, it's a long time no see. So we've been sent loads of questions. We've tried to pick a good selection so we can cover a lot of areas that you really wanted to know about. So let's get going, and we'll leave it to the lovely panellists to decide. Decide who's going to answer.
Can I just say, if your question doesn't get asked, we had to pick some questions and some were a bit similar.
And if you do have any kind of still kind of bubbling around in your head, do tweet us with the hashtag Spectrum Live, and they may be included in a future episode. So shall we get on with the questions?
Yes.
Lovely, no pressure. So to start, we've got Kenny via email asked, what is the government doing to tackle the autism diagnosis crisis? I'm looking at you, Tim.
Yeah, okay. So, following our campaign that I was talking on earlier, the government has committed to doing some things. So the first thing is it's collecting the data for the first time ever, which I mentioned earlier, and that's really important. The second thing is that some people may remember over the summer, the NHS in England decided on its long-term plan, its vision for the next 10 years, and it included autism as a clinical priority within that, which is really massive news, which is really good. And for children especially, diagnosis waiting times is a commitment in that plan for driving that down, which is, again, really good to see. But of course, there's not only a government in England, there's also governments in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland as well. And each of those, we're campaigning in each of those areas to bring down diagnosis waiting times too. So there's recently a bill in Wales, and there's a new service that's been set up called the Integrated Autism Service across the country to do diagnosis. And then in Scotland, we've got a call out as well for a waiting time standard there. So there's lots of governments that we need to do things, but some of them have done some things, some really good things, and some, they need to do some more.
More things to be done.
There's always more things to be done.
And this is kind of a great follow-up question from James via email, and he asks, how can we hold local authorities accountable for their diagnosis waiting times?
That's a very good question. I suspect George will have a couple of answers as well. But I think one of the first things is to find out what the average waiting time for your area is, to see if everyone's in the same situation, and then speak to your local representative, speak to your MP, go and talk to your CCG if you can. But I suspect there's a couple of other things that George might want to mention as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think speaking to your CCG is a very positive step, and actually CCGs up and down the country really are looking for autistic representation on their boards in order to be able to create services that work for autistic people. On top of this, you could speak to councils and councillors as well as your MP. Every local authority in the UK has an autism partnership board, and this is something which helps to shape the services that autistic people and families receive. And if you're not happy with something and you have the time, definitely invest that time in trying to change it for the better. What we do here in the National Autistic Society's kind of head office is we will support you through our branch network and also our policy and campaigns team to really make sure that you can do the best that you can to help your councillors create the best that they can, and that's something we're really keen to promote.
So I know that, I'm so sorry.
Oh no, that's fine. Shall I go?
Yeah,
that's fine.
Sorry.
We're very polite here on Spectrum Live. So we've got, Sarah has sent us in an email with 2 questions, so, bit of a challenge. So number 1 is, why is PDA, so that's pathological demand avoidance, not in the DSM-5? And number 2 is, why are girls and women repeatedly failed to be diagnosed with autism? Could it be that the disco isn't often used enough by the NHS?
Well, that's a long question.
Just to say, the disco is a diagnostic tool.
Yes, which we developed, of course.
Yeah.
Yes, Lorna Wing designed the disco. Coming back to the first question about PDA and DSM-5. DSM-5 is a diagnostic system, so and it doesn't have PDA in it because it doesn't exist as a diagnosis, as in it's not recognised internationally as a diagnosis yet. In order for a diagnosis to get into any of the systems, they need to undergo some research and evaluation to see that A, it's meaningful, reliable, it makes some predictions over time, and it's something that everybody agrees on. So at the moment there's a lot of discussion going on, really fruitful discussion, and I think possibly in time it may end up in DSM-5, but it may not. We'll wait and see. And the second question,
yes, about
women and girls. Yes, so, well, as we were talking earlier, it seems from our observations and what we know about women and girls is they're very good at masking and sort of compensating for some of their difficulties. So that often gets in the way of coming to a decision about diagnosis. And as for the disco, well, yes, we would advocate the disco being used more because it's a more thorough, flexible tool to assess, and it's much better at picking up the nuances or the differences that you might see in women and girls.
Can I ask what the DISCO stands for?
Yes, good questions. Diagnostic Interview for Social and Communication Disorders.
Great. So the next question I have is from Ian via email, and he asks, what difference has the Autism Act made? Which I think is probably a question that many autistic people and their families are thinking.
So the Autism Act is an act that only applies in England, especially probably the first thing to say. And as I was saying earlier, it's been around for 10 years, and part of what it's done and what the impact it's had is what we're looking at this year. But I think there are a few things that we can definitely say the Autism Act has made a difference. The first is that if you reflect on it, 10 years ago we were having to bring forward an act through Parliament that was telling people that autistic adults existed. That that kind of awareness that autism followed people through their life and it wasn't only a children's condition, that's fundamentally changed over the last 10 years. But also thinking more tangibly about what services are available in the area. Well, now there are adult autism diagnostic pathways in almost every area, whereas they were in fewer than half the areas in England before. Pretty much every area, bar like 2, now has something called an autism lead, so a lead commissioner who has responsibility for autism and improving services in their area. Again, that's something that really didn't happen before, and we've seen some specialist autism teams develop in some parts of the country as well. But I think, and this is the big but to that question, the impact firstly hasn't been big enough, not all the guidance is being followed, and also it's too variable between regions, so what's developed is a bit of a postcode lottery. Like your diagnosis waiting time as an adult might depend on what side of a street you live on because you might be in different areas. And that's not good enough. So, what we want to do this year when we're looking at the Autism Act is think, okay, how do we make sure that not only does it say good things on paper, not only does the strategy say good things, but how do we make sure that those are implemented and they really get put in place on the ground and transform people's lives?
And am I right in thinking that the NAS website has a list of all the commissioners in England?
Well, and actually those are about to be updated because every couple of years, every local authority gets a survey about how well it's implementing the Autism Act from Public Health England, one of the government sort of arm's length bodies. They're just about to publish the results of that, and that does include the details of who your lead commissioner for autism is. And so if you want to find out who it is, we will be promoting what those results are once they're out, hopefully in the next couple of months. And so keep an eye on the website, I think.
And if you want more information about your specific area, you can download the results from your area of the self-assessment.
Yeah.
I think also one thing to mention is within our policy and campaigns team at the moment, we are actually looking for research volunteers to help us evaluate this survey. And this is a really good opportunity for people from their local area to kind of see what the services are looking like in their local authority. And the best way to really see what's going on is to really get involved and to help us understand as a national picture. And it's really good for people who are curious and nosy too, right? So do definitely take a look on the website to see that opportunity as well.
And if when you look, you disagree with what has been reported in the self-assessment, in that survey, well then there's an opportunity to go and talk to your local commissioners, to do all the things that George was talking about before, about going to your partnership board, to be like, well, that isn't my experience, so how can we make sure that it's improved?
Fantastic, thank you. Dare you assume curious and nosy? My goodness, would never ever be.
That's what I am.
What are you talking about? So we've got Jess has emailed us about her son. Actually, she says my son is 4, and it seems likely that he has autism. However, our local paediatrician is understandably cautious about diagnosing children before they are a little bit older. 7 years old seems to be the magic number. So in the meantime, without a formal diagnosis, what support can we access? She says his needs are largely around sleep and sensory processing, but she would also benefit from support, training or guidance with dealing with behaviour, rigid routines, etc.
Okay, shall I take that question? So there is no magic age, of course, for a diagnostic assessment. We rarely make assessments before the age of 2 in terms of confirming a diagnosis, but there is, as I say, no magic age. However, there may be good reasons why the clinicians are thinking of delaying the assessment there. It's hard to know without knowing the details, but in the meantime, it's really important that she gets some help and support. And certainly with the sleep, that's often an area of real challenge for both parents and young people. And there may be a sleep clinic or sleep service in their local area, probably through the community paediatric or early intervention services, and it might need several professionals involved, possibly to look at the biological aspects that might be going on. So there may be some issues around the young person not having enough melatonin to induce sleep, which is a natural hormone, but it also may need some psychological support around developing new patterns to help with getting into a routine. And the sensory things, a paediatric OT would be a really good idea to get a referral.
Occupational therapist.
Yes, yeah, occupational therapists, yeah.
And sorry, just to add as well, that, you know, in the law, it says that those things shouldn't be contingent on having a diagnosis.
Absolutely.
So, you know, it's not about waiting around, and commissioners shouldn't be saying, oh, you have to wait for a diagnosis for these things. Things like a child in need assessment, an education, health and care plan assessment, those should all happen regardless of whether someone has a diagnosis, but whether they have a need or appear to have a need. And so, you know, that's really important to remember if you get told no the first time, because a lot of people are, and they have to go back again.
So, Jess, if you're watching, I think some really good advice there from our lovely panel. You can probably find some information on the National Autistic Society website as well, and the National Autistic Society helpline. Information's on our website, and that opens at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. So do give them a call if there's any further advice. They may be able to help you. But thank you for that.
And just to say, we've been getting more and more questions from you. Thank you so much for making this interactive. Yeah. It's fantastic to know people are out there watching us. So this question is from Jenny, and I think that this is a really well expressed question. And it's for Sarah, I guess. So Jenny writes, I'm 16 and waiting for a ASD assessment. ASD stands for Autism Spectrum Disorder. And she's been waiting since October 2018. And she wants to know, how will I be assessed by SALT, which is the speech and language team, on the day, because I'm no longer a toddler. Will I be given a toy to play with? I don't know what questions they'll ask.
So speech and language therapists work with all ages across the lifespan, children and adults, and they are often part of a diagnostic assessment team. With an adult, the speech and language therapist is going to be looking at more interactive things, more conversation, more talking to the person about their experience in terms of their difficulties in communication, or how they use their language in social situations, whether non-verbal aspects of communication are difficult for them. So they're going to be more focused on their real lived experience and what it's like. There are assessment tools, and she may be referring to something called the ADOS, which is the Autism Diagnostic and Observation Schedule, which is a systematic way of looking at behaviour, but it doesn't always work very well for adults. It's one of those tools that may be used, but not necessarily.
And this seems related, I hope you don't mind, Erin, but somebody else has asked, should they bring somebody with them to the diagnostic assessment?
Well, we certainly at Lorna Wing Centre always encourage that, both for our benefit in terms of being able to have another person to gather information from, but also for individuals to have support during the day, during their assessment.
Does that person have to have known them all their life? The person being diagnosed brings with them their supporter, if you like. Do they have to have known the person being diagnosed all their life?
It's helpful if they've known them over a period of time, but not necessarily all their life. No, it's also the individual's choice what they want to do, of course.
Great, I'll shut up now. Sorry,
no, that's fine. So from a personal perspective, having gone through the process, myself, having a family member there was really helpful, because my mum could answer questions that I potentially couldn't answer. So there would be, maybe they'd say, do you do this? And I'd go, no, I don't do that. And my mum would go, you do that. So that can be, if you've got that support, I would say personally, obviously not professionally, but personally, it's good to have that person there. But it's not necessary to get. If you don't have someone there who can support you, it's not going to. You don't need to worry about that.
Yeah.
So, speaking, we mentioned ADOS there.
Yes.
So Debbie has emailed in and said that her son is suspected ASD / Asperger's, but the paediatrics in their area don't use ADOS. She's been told it's only likely he'll be picked up by the ADOS. So what can she do? Could you also, because we didn't touch on this earlier, explain a little bit about what is Asperger's? You know, is there a difference autism and Asperger's as well in terms of that?
So I'll just sort of talk to the ADOS bit first. So it's not true that you have to have an ADOS, an assessment, to confirm a diagnosis of autism. That is one of the myths. It is one of the tools that can be helpful in aiding an assessment and enabling the clinician to evaluate and to make decisions. So the more important thing in that assessment is that the paediatricians take a really thorough developmental history and actually see the child holistically in all settings as well. Coming back to your other question about Asperger's syndrome, yes, that is one, has been for a long while, one of the subtypes, if you like, in the autism spectrum. And of course, we started off with autism as a very kind of tight definition, and we moved out to different groups and subgroups on this spectrum. But actually now we're moving more to a dimensional approach to autism and thinking the whole shades of social communication difficulties. So we think more in terms of profiles than autism rather than subtypes or groups. But you know, it's one of those things that again is being discussed because a lot of people do rather like the term Asperger's syndrome, and it's something they want to keep.
Also, just to say, going back slightly to the previous question about diagnosis, that both the ADOS and the DISCO have, in ADOS they're called modules, but they have ways to test adults that don't. They're not going to like give you a Barbie doll and go, here you go. You know, like, not that there's anything wrong with Barbie dolls, but like maybe if you're 40, you might not want to play with a Barbie doll, which is fair enough.
Absolutely.
Or you might be like me and be like, yes.
And that's totally cool. That's cool anyway. But I can understand. I suppose what I mean is that if you're not into playing with toys as an adult, that's totally cool.
Yeah.
So Marcia, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, says, after several visits to chase up my request, being fobbed off with telephone numbers which were not connected to my case, and after emailing the practice secretary, I assume she means GP practice, and being eventually informed that I fell 1 point outside the cut-off point in order to be considered for assessment, what can I do?
Well, that one sounds quite tricky. I think the first thing is, Marseille probably be worth at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, or at some point after, giving our helpline a ring, because they can give you some more specific advice. But what it sounds like is you are an adult who is looking for a diagnosis, and that means you have rights under the Autism Act. If that there should be a pathway that's available to you, that's accessible to you, and your GP should make you a referral if they think that's right and that's proper. I think something that Sarah might be able to shed more light on is that sometimes the GP will quite rightly say, actually, I don't think it's going to be a likely diagnosis, so you don't need to go forward for it. But in most instances, they should be making that referral to make sure that all the public bodies are abiding by the Autism Act and making sure that they're not applying sort of rigid and dogmatic rules that. Let's face it, autism is a spectrum condition. Bits of it can fluctuate at times, and people's needs can be very different one day to the other. So to apply rules too rigidly can really be to the detriment of the individual. So I'd suggest writing back to your doctor and saying, look, under the Autism Act, I should have a right to a diagnostic assessment if it's the proper way forward. Can you explain to me why you don't think that is, and do you not think I should be referred?
And just to add to that, this is, I think, an example where a screening tool is used, which is a way of sort of sifting out people who need to go down different pathways. And they're not perfect, they don't always work. But I guess I would also encourage that you get supporting evidence, so observations or other information from other professionals that you take to your GP to help make your case, really.
Could I ask the next question, because it kind of relates to that question? So this question is from Stacey, and she writes, I have a child who has been discharged from the ASD pathway. Her diagnosis was learning difficulties, global coordination disorder, anxiety and social and communication disorder. She is a severely autistic sister. Her father has autism. I disagreed with the decision not to diagnose her, as she also scored on the ADOS and SLT, also feels she's autistic. But because she's very good at masking, she didn't get diagnosed. How do I fight against the decision without going privately?
That's a really tricky one. I mean, the first thing is you have a right to ask again. There's nothing that says once you've asked and you've been told no, well, that's it. You can go back to your doctor and say, I don't think that was right on the day. My daughter was, like, she masks the signs of autism quite well. I don't think they really got to the crux of what her difficulties or issues might be. So I think that's the first thing, go back and ask again. There are also complaints procedures that you could go through, both within your practice and your CCG. So you could, complain against the decision that's been made. Or eventually you might want to take it up with the Parliamentary and Health Services Ombudsman, who is the person that regulates all those services and deals with complaints about them. There's lots more information about how to do those kinds of things on our website, autism.org.uk. Loads of information, so I suggest probably looking there. But I think as a first step, ask again.
Fantastic. Kind of leading on from that, we have actually had a question come in whilst we've been live. So thank you ever so much to Izzy for tweeting us your question. This is definitely a question that I can relate to rather heavily, and I'm sure a lot of people can out there. It says, I mask my symptoms, and I'm worried that people may not think I'm autistic.
Right. Well, again, I guess that goes back to the way the assessment is conducted, because it's very important to obviously listen to the individual who's experiencing these difficulties and hear their accounts. And in our experience in assessing women and girls, they're actually very good at telling us what's difficult and how it rolls for them and the kinds of things that they want help with. So I think my colleagues really need to listen.
Absolutely.
So once you've got the diagnosis, and there are a lot of people. There's I think 700,000 autistic people in. Is that just the UK or England specifically? The UK wide, yeah. And well, there's probably loads of people that aren't diagnosed. But Zoe, who is diagnosed, she writes, what rights do I, as an autistic adult, have to care and support following diagnosis?
This is a really good one about the Autism Act and essentially what impact it could have on someone's life as long as it's followed. There's a lot in something called the statutory guidance, which is the bit that tells local authorities and CCGs exactly what they should be doing, that says when you get a diagnosis you should be told, well, you might, as well as that, you may well trigger the social care needs criteria, so you might be eligible for some care and support with your everyday life, perhaps with finding help around finding a job if that's something that you're finding difficult. It might enable you to make a claim for student support, any of those kinds of things. So you should be told that that's available to you. If they're going to follow that statutory guidance really well, and all too few areas do on this, they should actually be sharing information between the CCG and the local authority as well, to make sure that the local authority then contacts you and says, you might have a need. Why don't you come in for an assessment and we'll see what those needs might be. Now that might not end up with you being eligible for extra support, but it's always better to check. And there are often, although there's fewer and fewer of them at the moment, services out there that are for people who are not what we call Care Act eligible, so they haven't met the thresholds for having the needs that social care services might provide, but more general services which might be available to them. Those are all the kinds of things that should be available. But as we were saying earlier as well, it's important to remember that actually care and support needs, benefits applications, all of those things, they're not contingent on having a diagnosis. So don't hold off and wait until you've had your diagnosis to make sure you've made those applications.
I was going to say, I must have missed that call from my local authority.
I think a lot of people
maybe my phone was turned off at the time. Who knows? Kind of a good kind of segue into Kate's question. Kate's contacted us via email and has said, what's the benefit of being diagnosed? I know I have some thoughts, but I shall put it to you first.
Well, I guess the first benefit is self-awareness and self-knowledge, is kind of getting to know yourself better, and both in terms of your strengths as well as the things you find challenging, but also maybe getting some information about what kinds of support could be helpful to you, some very specially tailored advice as well, because it needs to be consistent with what your profile is showing. So I think those are the key things, really, sort of self-awareness and sort of confidence, really, to be able to talk about your diagnosis.
I think just on that, I think if you're an autistic person, you are autistic, whether you are pre or post-diagnosis. And so the behaviours or the things that you might find difficult don't change because you have a diagnosis. And so what I think that means is just giving you that understanding to kind of adapt your lifestyle and adapt the way that you do things in order to kind of reduce the anxiety that you can face in certain situations is really useful just for your general health, your mental health. This is something that I really understand really well, and there are certain things that I definitely have over time, as I've got to learn about myself a lot better, I've definitely changed to really come out of my shell. That's something that I personally at school found really quite difficult, but little tips to kind of walk into like a conversation, for example, which used to be quite difficult for me. I've kind of got coping strategies which really stem from the support I got through receiving my diagnosis and that I was entitled to because of my diagnosis, have really helped me to grow as a person. And so I cannot stress enough just how beneficial a diagnosis has been, at least for me personally.
I think with me and my diagnosis, I got my diagnosis at 23, so I'd had 23 lovely years without one. And something that I found was that after I got my diagnosis, I acted more autistic because I'd spent 23 years kind of pushing things down and pretending that I was a normal person. And
you are normal.
I am a normal person. Well,
just autistic
I know many people who would disagree.
Well, not just
because I'm autistic, but you know, that acting like everybody else, and having a diagnosis kind of gave me the freedom to little things like we talk about flappy hands, like things like stimming, and the fact that I find a huge amount of comfort in soft toys. So I was finding like, oh, I can have soft toys as an adult. It's something about it just clicked that for me, and that's definitely had a huge impact on my mental health. And it's also enabled us to do things like, as a family, at Christmas, it's an unwritten rule that if there are family members over and Erin disappears into her room, that's fine, she'll be out eventually, don't bother her. And that has made things like Christmases a whole lot easier for my family as well, because I think they felt like they were doing something wrong or that I was being difficult, but it's kind of, there's definitely more harmony. So I think that self-knowledge, I think, is really important and empowering and allows you to be yourself a little bit more, I think, definitely. So.
I've got a couple of questions for Sarah. So the first one is, can a blood test diagnose autism? And are doctors being re-educated in the changes on diagnostic criteria?
So taking the blood test question, autism, as we talked earlier, is a developmental condition, so there is no blood test, and the way we assess or diagnose for autism is based on individual behaviour profiles and the way that individual has developed. So no, not really. I'm sorry, the second question?
Are doctors being re-educated on the changes of the diagnostic criteria?
Well, certainly there will be lots of updates needed with the new criteria coming in the ICD-11, which will be out in a little while. Not this year, but in a couple of years. It will be necessary, yes, to revisit the criteria, because we have shifted in those criteria to a more dimensional approach as they're getting away from these subcategories and thinking about autism in dimensions. So yeah, I think there will be a plan needed.
I think we've got one more. This one has come from Billy, who's actually watching us on YouTube right now. So hello, Billy. Great to see you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching us.
We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Hopefully we're not letting you down.
Hope you're enjoying it.
And absolutely. And Billy says, what should I expect from my assessment? will I have to do activities?
This sort of goes back to an earlier
Yeah.
question, doesn't it? So I'm guessing Billy's an adult who's thinking about what will happen in my assessment. I think the thing to emphasise is there may be some activities required. Those don't necessarily involve toys. They may be activities involving problem solving, looking at how you think and reason and work things out, both in a social situation but in situations which have got nothing to do with social interaction as well. So some of those might be pencil paper type things. They may be doing puzzles and things. It will vary. So it doesn't always involve toys.
Fantastic. Believe that is our last question from our Q&A.
Well, thank you so much. And as Erin said earlier, if you want to submit questions after this broadcast, we might be able to answer them in future episodes. Speaking of future episodes, please do consider donating if you want more Spectrum Live. We'll be looking at topics like socialising, mental health, finding work, and basically the things that you told us that were important to you. So with your support, we can do more to change the lives and attitudes of autistic people and their families. So donate on the website www.autism.org.uk.
And I think, as we've said as well, if you do need further support or you want any more information about anything that's been discussed, we're very well aware that an hour is not nearly enough time to answer everything that you need. You can visit the National Autistic Society website, autism.org. Is it .uk? .uk, there we go. And to get information, there's a diagnosis page, and there's lots of other topics on there as well. We should have a handy link in our homepage and maybe in the comments as well to the diagnosis page on the website for you.
And if you need support, our free to access helpline opens tomorrow at 10 AM. It's confidential and you can get expert advice and support about autism for autistic people and their families and friends. And you can find out more information about that from our website.
So, I believe we're wrapping up. Thank you to everyone who's been involved in the show tonight. We've got our lovely panel here. We've got our previous guests. We've got Samita and Florence. We hope you've had a good time. We've had a good time. I think we've had a very good time.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, if all else fails, we've had a good time.
But it's important you've had a good time.
Yeah, that's important as well.
The next pilot episode will be about getting out and about, and you can get involved. You can send us a video, no longer than 15 seconds though, please, and you can email it to socialmedia@nas.org.uk, and you can also tweet us using the hashtag SpectrumLive.
So we are, the next pilot episode that Robbie mentioned will be going out on Wednesday the 24th of April. So you've got a little bit of time to think about it if you want to send in a video. But before then is actually World Autism Awareness Week, and it's definitely not too late to get involved with that one, and you can find out more on the National Autistic Society website.
Thank you to all our guests, especially our viewers, production team, the National Autistic Society, and all our guests. Bye-bye!